A man marked by pain, a young woman delivered as a token of vengeance. In the mansion where silence screams, the unexpected happens, a dangerous love is born. She was too pure for his world, and that drove him mad. If you like stories of love and romance, watch until the end and you won't regret it. Subscribe to this channel and leave your comment saying where you are listening to this beautiful story from. We continue. Helen didn't know what hurt more, being treated as a bargaining chip or realizing that, in the silence that preceded her handover, no one had even asked what she wanted. The daughter of a ruined businessman, marked by a life of emotional scarcity and broken promises, she grew up among the rubble of a home that prioritized appearances, debts, and questionable alliances. The Upper East Side apartment where she grew up had a view of mirrored skyscrapers, but inside it accumulated overdue bills, whispered arguments, and the bitter smell of financial desperation. Her father, Robert Miller, had once owned a respected construction company in the city. He built high-rises on the Upper East Side in Soho and Tribeca, had his name stamped on gold plaques, and frequented the best clubs in New York City. But greed and some shady deals with corrupt politicians made it all collapse like a house of cards in the rain. At 22, Helen's hands were always cold and her heart was on fire as she found herself before the electronic gates of the gated community in the Hamptons, where Leonard Asher Croft's mansion was located. She wasn't there as a guest, she was there as payment. A deal had been sealed between her father and Leonard, the silent, ruthless businessman who commanded, with invisible hands, an empire that crossed borders between the legal and the questionable, between legitimate markets and businesses no one dared to investigate too deeply. The light May rain wet the windows of the black sedan that had brought her there. The driver, a man in a cheap suit who wouldn't make eye contact, had received specific orders. "Take the girl and don't say a word," were the words Helen had heard her father murmur into the phone 3 days earlier. She had pretended to be asleep on the living room sofa, but each word had embedded itself in her chest like shards of glass. Leonard hadn't asked for Helen. He had demanded her. Her name wasn't just a convenient solution to a $12 million debt, but part of a revenge built on decades of accumulated rage. Robert Miller, years before, had been one of those responsible for destroying Leonard's mother. Not financially, but emotionally and spiritually. No one knew. No one ever knew that Marion Croft didn't die in the car accident, as the newspapers of the time had reported. She had slowly gone mad after being betrayed, publicly humiliated, and silenced by a corruption scheme that involved Helen's father's construction company. Marion was an IRS auditor and had discovered irregularities in the Miller construction projects. When she tried to report it, she was blackmailed, harassed, and slandered. Her marriage to Leonard's father fell apart. She lost her job, her reputation, her sanity. For years, she lived in a psychiatric clinic in the Berkshires, under the name Marion Smith, forgotten by the world. Leonard, who was only 17 at the time, witnessed his mother's collapse, powerless to do anything. He saw his father, crying secretly in his study. He saw his family disintegrate. When he became a man, he decided he would take justice into his own hands. He built an empire of companies, transport, construction, imports, some legal, others not so much. He waited for the right moment. When Robert Miller came begging for a loan, Leonard smiled for the first time in years. He didn't want the money back. He wanted something much more valuable. "Your daughter," he had said, his voice as calm as someone asking for sugar in their coffee. "For 6 months. She comes to live with me. It's either that or you declare bankruptcy tomorrow and also face charges for tax evasion." Robert Miller knew he had no choice. Helen was all he had left that was good in the world. But between losing his daughter temporarily and losing her forever visiting an imprisoned father in jail, he chose to give up what he loved most to save what was left of his own dignity. Leonard's mansion in the Hamptons looked like a luxury bunker. High walls, cameras everywhere, automatic gates that closed with a sinister sound. The house itself was modern, with clean lines and a lot of glass, but it gave an impression of coldness, like a museum where no one actually lived. Helen was greeted by Mrs. Davies, a woman from the South in her 60s, who had worked for Leonard for over 2 decades. "Mr. Croft is in his study," Mrs. Davies said, avoiding looking directly at Helen. "He said for you to settle into the room on the second floor, the blue one." Helen climbed the marble staircase, carrying only a small suitcase. She hadn't brought much: some clothes, books, her maternal grandmother's necklace. The blue room was beautiful, spacious, with a view of the mansion's inner garden. It had a queen-sized bed, a huge walk-in closet and a private bathroom with a tub, but it also had a keyhole on the outside. Helen tested it. The door could be locked by someone in the hallway. It was almost 9 at night when Leonard appeared. Helen was sitting in the armchair near the window, trying to read a book to calm her nerves. She couldn't. The words danced on the page like nervous butterflies. When the door opened, she rose slowly, like someone expecting a gunshot. Leonard Ashcroft was 35 years old, 6'1", with dark hair always combed back and honey-colored eyes that could have been handsome if they weren't so cold. He wore a navy blue dress shirt, no tie, sleeves rolled up to his elbows. He had the bearing of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "Helen Miller," he said, as if reading from a document. His voice was deep, polite, but carried a weight that made the air thicker. "Yes," she replied, and hated how small her own voice sounded. "I'll be direct with you. I'm not interested in pretending this is anything other than what it is. Your father owes me $12 million, money he will never be able to repay. You will stay here for 6 months. After that, we'll consider the accounts settled." Helen swallowed hard. "And what do you expect from me during these 6 months?" Leonard studied her for a long moment. She wore a simple navy blue dress she had bought at a downtown department store. She had no jewelry, no elaborate makeup. Her brown hair was down, a little messy from the rain. But there was something in her eyes, a mixture of fear and defiance that bothered him in a way he hadn't expected. "You will not leave this house without my authorization. You will not use a phone without my permission. You will eat when I allow it. You will sleep when I say so. Your life, for the next 6 months, belongs to me. And if I don't accept? You don't have a choice, just as I didn't." There was something in the way he said those last words that made Helen realize there was much more behind this than a simple debt. But before she could ask anything, Leonard was already leaving the room. "Mrs. Davies will explain the house. Rules. Good night, Helen." The door closed with a soft click, but Helen clearly heard the sound of the key turning from the outside. She was trapped. Literally trapped in a mansion in the Hamptons, in the hands of a man who looked at her as if she were a piece in a very complex and dangerous chess game. She sat on the bed and finally allowed the tears to fall. She wasn't crying out of self-pity, but out of anger. Anger at the father who put her in this situation. Anger at herself for not being able to stop it. Anger at that man who spoke as if she were an object, a property to be managed. But deep down, a part of her, a part she didn't want to admit, was curious. There was pain in Leonard's eyes, an old, deep pain that echoed her own, and Helen had always been drawn to mysteries, especially those involving wounded hearts. Outside, the rain continued to fall on the Hamptons, washing the deserted streets and the secrets that all those high walls tried to hide. Helen didn't know it, but she was about to discover that some prisons are built not just with concrete and steel, but with memories, guilt, and a desire for revenge that can consume both the prisoner and the jailer. Downstairs, Leonard poured himself a double whiskey and stared out the study window. 20 years planning this moment. 20 years building enough power to destroy Robert Miller, in the same way he had destroyed his family. But when he saw Helen in that room, something inside him trembled in a way it hadn't in a long time. She was more beautiful than he had expected, younger, more innocent. And that bothered him because it made the revenge more complex, more personal. It was easier to hate an abstract enemy than to look into the eyes of that enemy's daughter and see the same vulnerability he himself carried. He drank the whiskey in one go and poured another. It was going to be a long night. And for the next 6 months it was going to be a dangerous game where he wasn't sure who would come out the winner. The first week in the mansion passed like a slow-motion film. Helen would wake up at 7 in the morning to the sound of the gardeners mowing the lawn. She had breakfast alone in the huge kitchen, under the watchful but gentle gaze of Mrs. Davies. The food was plentiful and delicious, warm French bread, fresh fruit, freshly brewed coffee, but it tasted of prison all the same. Leonard left for work early and came back late. When he was home, Helen would hear the sound of his footsteps in the hall, the sound of the television in the study, occasionally the clinking of glasses when he poured himself a drink. But he didn't come to her room, didn't talk, didn't offer any explanations. It was as if she were a ghost he knew existed, but preferred to ignore. "Mrs. Davies," Helen asked on Thursday morning while helping to dry the dishes, "how long have you worked here?" The woman hesitated, looking around as if someone might be listening. "Since Mr. Leonard was a boy, dear. I took care of him when his mother got sick." "Sick? I can't talk about those things," Mrs. Davies said quickly, but her eyes grew sad. "Mr. Croft doesn't like us talking about the past." Helen noticed how everyone in the house, Mrs. Davies, the groundskeeper John, the cleaner Marlene, who came 3 times a week, treated Leonard with a mixture of respect and fear. They called him Mr. Croft, a title of reverence, the kind given to powerful men, even in a sophisticated Hamptons mansion. On Saturday morning, Helen woke to the sound of classical music coming from somewhere in the house. It was a piano. Someone was playing Chopin with impeccable technique, but with a melancholy that made her chest tighten. She put on a robe and slowly left her room, following the melody down the marble hallways. The music was coming from a room at the end of the second-floor hall. The door was ajar. Helen peeked carefully and saw Leonard sitting at the piano, his fingers gliding over the keys with a delicacy that completely contrasted with the coldness he displayed day to day. He was wearing only grey sweatpants and a white t-shirt. His hair was messy, as if he had just woken up. The music stopped abruptly when he realized he was being watched. "Sorry," Helen said, stepping back from the door. "I didn't know you." "That I what?" Leonard turned on the piano bench, and she could see that his eyes were red, as if he had been drinking or crying. Maybe both. "That you played the piano?" He gave a bitter laugh. "My mother taught me. She said a man needs to have at least one way to express what he can't say." It was the first time he had mentioned his mother in Helen's presence. She took a step into the room, curious. It was a beautiful space with shelves full of books, an entire wall of windows overlooking the garden, and the black grand piano dominating the center. On the walls were paintings, not the expensive abstract ones that decorated the rest of the house, but hand-painted landscapes, portraits, still lifes. "Did she paint too?" Helen asked, approaching a painting that showed a dark-haired woman sitting in a garden. Leonard tensed. "How do you know she was the one who painted it?" "Woman's intuition, and because there's a signature in the corner, M. Croft, 1995. He got up from the bench and walked to the window, turning his back to Helen. "Marion, my name is Marion Croft," he said, as if quoting someone. She always introduced herself like that. Full name, as if it were important for people to remember who she was. Helen felt she was treading on dangerous ground, but something in Leonard's voice, a vulnerability he couldn't completely hide, encouraged her to continue. "Did she die?" she asked softly. Leonard took a long time to answer. When he did, his voice was heavy with an old anger, but also with pain. "To me, yes, to the world too, but technically no." Before Helen could ask what that meant, he turned and faced her, his eyes hard again. "You shouldn't be in here. This room is private." "You left the door open." "That was a mistake." Helen crossed her arms. A week of silence and coldness had fueled a rebelliousness she didn't know she possessed. "A lot of things in your life seem to be mistakes, Leonard, including keeping me locked up here like a prisoner of war." "You are a prisoner," he said, approaching her, "but not of war, of justice." "Justice? What justice? I don't even know what my father is accused of. I don't even know why you hate me so much without even knowing me." Leonard stopped just inches from her. Helen could smell his cologne mixed with whiskey, and something she could only describe as sadness. He was tall and she had to lift her chin to look into his eyes. "Your father," he said slowly, "destroyed my family. Not financially, emotionally, spiritually. He turned my mother into a shadow of who she was, and when she couldn't take it anymore, When she finally broke, he just moved on, as if nothing had happened. What kind of lie is that? My father may be a lot of bad things, but he would never— Never what? Leonard interrupted her. Never blackmail an IRS auditor to cover up tax evasion? Never threaten an honest woman to protect his dirty business? Never destroy someone's reputation to save his own skin? Helen felt the world spin. What are you talking about? 1995, Helen. Your Miller construction was being investigated for tax evasion. My mother, Marion Croft, was the auditor in charge of the case. She discovered an off-the-books accounting scheme that involved millions of dollars. When she tried to formalize the complaint, your father approached her. Leonard walked to a bookshelf and took out a manila folder, yellowed with age. He threw it on the coffee table. "Read," he said. "These are copies of everything my mother saved before she went mad." Helen opened the folder with trembling hands. There were documents, photos, newspaper clippings, a handwritten letter that began with, "Marion, my dear friend." It was her father's handwriting. As she read, she felt her stomach churn. Robert Miller didn't just offer Marion a bribe. When she refused, he threatened her. He said he had pictures of her leaving a motel with a married colleague, pictures that didn't exist, but that he promised to forge if necessary. He threatened to spread rumors about her professional competence. He said he would make her lose her job, her reputation, everything. "She told me," Leonard continued, his voice growing lower and more dangerous. "My father was away on business. She came home crying, desperate. She said a man was trying to destroy everything she had worked for her entire life. I was 17, Helen. I didn't understand the gravity of the situation. I thought she was exaggerating." Helen kept reading. There were medical reports, prescriptions for antidepressants, certificates of psychiatric hospitalization, a resignation letter from the IRS dated 3 months after her father's first contact. "She held on for a few weeks," Leonard said, now standing again in front of the window. "She tried to proceed with the investigation despite the threats, but your father was one step ahead. He had contacts at the IRS. He managed to get the case transferred to another auditor, an auditor who was more flexible in his interpretations." "And your mother?" "She started having panic attacks. Couldn't sleep, couldn't work. My father tried to help, but she pushed everyone away. She started drinking, said she had failed, that she was a coward for not facing the threats. The guilt was killing her from the inside." Helen closed the folder. Her hands were shaking so much that the papers rustled like leaves in the wind. "Leonard, 6 months later she had a nervous breakdown at work. She was put on leave. Then she was hospitalized. Then she just disappeared from our lives. My father couldn't handle the situation. I was finishing high school, trying to get into college. When she was discharged, she wasn't the same person." Leonard turned to Helen and she could see tears in his eyes. "Do you know where my mother is today, Helen?" "In a clinic in the Berkshires. 28 years later. She's 63 years old and lives under the name Marion Smith because she can't deal with her own real name. She can't hear about auditing, the IRS, taxes. Any mention of those things makes her have anxiety attacks." Helen sank heavily into an armchair. The world around her seemed to be crumbling brick by brick. "My father never told me any of this." "Of course not. To him it was just an obstacle in his path, an annoying public servant who needed to be neutralized. He got what he wanted. The case was closed. Miller Construction continued to operate. He continued to evade taxes for another 15 years until he was finally caught. And when did you find out about all this?" "When I was 21. My mother had a moment of lucidity during one of my visits to the clinic. She told me everything, showed me the documents she had hidden, made me promise that one day I would get justice." Helen got up from the armchair and walked over to him. "Leonard, I didn't know any of this. I was 5 years old in 1995. I know," he said, but his voice carried no forgiveness. "That's why you're here for 6 months and not for the rest of your life. You're innocent of what your father did, but you are his daughter. You're the most precious thing he has. I want him to feel at least a fraction of the despair my mother felt." Helen understood in that moment that she was at the center of a revenge much bigger than she had imagined. It wasn't just about money or power. It was about love, madness, guilt, and the human need for justice when the system fails. And after the 6 months? She asked. Then you go home, and your father will carry for the rest of his life the weight of knowing he was capable of handing over his own daughter to pay for his crimes. Helen looked out the window of the room. The mansion's garden was beautiful, well kept, but she could see the high walls in the background. Beautiful, but still prison walls. And what if I don't want to leave after the 6 months? She asked, surprising herself with the question. Leonard looked at her as if she had lost her mind. Why would you want to stay here? Helen didn't have an answer for that. Not yet. But something about the way he had played the piano that morning, the sadness he carried in his eyes, the way his voice changed when he spoke of his mother, made her want to better understand who Leonard Asher was behind the thirst for revenge. I don't know, she said finally. Maybe because, for the first time in my life, someone is being completely honest with me about who they really are and what they really want. Leonard was silent for a long moment. Then he left the room without a word, leaving Helen alone with Marion's paintings and the piano that still held echoes of the melancholy he had played that morning. Outside, the first drops of a new rain began to fall on the Hamptons, as if the sky too were crying for all the injustices those mansions hid behind their perfect facades. After the conversation in the music room, something shifted in the dynamic between Helen and Leonard. He didn't lock her bedroom door again. She began to move freely through the house, exploring each room like an archaeologist discovering lost civilizations. The mansion had a library with over 2,000 books, a home theater in the basement, a complete gym and an indoor pool that no one seemed to have used in years. Helen developed a routine. She would wake up early, have breakfast with Mrs. Davies, walk through the inner garden, and read in the library in the afternoon. At night, when Leonard came home from work, she would watch him discreetly. He always went straight to his study, spoke on the phone in a low, controlled tone she couldn't decipher, then went to the music room or his own bedroom. Sometimes, late at night, she would hear the piano. Always classical pieces, always melancholic. She began to recognize the repertoire: Chopin, Debussy, Satie. Music for people who carried ghosts. On the Monday of the third week, Helen was in the library when she found a photo album hidden between 2 economics books. The photos were old, from the 90s. They showed a happy family, a tall, bearded man, a beautiful, dark-haired woman with intelligent eyes, and a boy she immediately recognized as Leonard. He must have been about 15 or 16 in the photos. He was smiling. He looked normal. He looked happy. You shouldn't be touching that. Helen turned around. Leonard was at the library door, still wearing his work suit but with his tie loosened and his hair slightly disheveled. Sorry, she said, but she didn't close the album. You were handsome when you smiled. I was a different person. You were you, just a version of you that still believed the world could be a just place. Leonard entered the library and poured himself a whiskey from a small bar in the corner. Want one? He asked, holding up the bottle. Helen hesitated. I don't usually drink. I didn't used to be a kidnapper, he said, with bitter irony. But life has its surprises. She accepted the glass. The whiskey burned her throat, but the warmth that spread through her chest was comforting. They stood in silence for a few minutes, she flipping through the photos, he looking out the window. Your mother was very beautiful, Helen said finally. She was the most intelligent woman I ever knew. Spoke 3 languages, had 2 degrees, read 2 books a week. My father always said she was too smart for her own good. Do you visit her? Leonard drank his whiskey in one gulp. Once a month. Sometimes she recognizes me, sometimes she doesn't. When she does, she asks if I've gotten justice yet. If I've made the man who destroyed our family pay for what he did. And what do you tell her? That I'm working on it. Helen closed the album and placed it on the coffee table. Leonard, I understand your pain. I understand your anger, but this won't bring your mother back, and it won't heal the wounds you both carry. You don't understand anything, he said, but without his usual sharpness. He sounded more tired than angry. You're 22, born into a wealthy family, studied at the best schools, never had to fight for anything. Wealthy? Helen laughed, but there was no humor in it. Leonard, do you know where I went to high school? a public school in Queens, because my father was already in financial trouble and couldn't afford the private school tuition anymore. Do you know what my first job was? A salesgirl at a clothing store in the Queens Center Mall, making minimum wage to help with the bills at home. Leonard looked at her, surprised. Your father said you were studying architecture at NYU. I was. I paid for it with the money I earned working during the day and studying at night. It took me 6 years to graduate because sometimes I had to drop classes when I couldn't pay the tuition. Leonard poured himself another whiskey. Why didn't you tell me this before? Because you never asked. To you, I was just Robert Miller's spoiled daughter. A little doll you could use to hurt her father. Helen stood up and walked to the bookshelf. Want to know something funny? I chose architecture because I wanted to build beautiful things. I always hated the way my father built. Ugly, cheap, soulless buildings. I wanted to do it differently. I wanted to create spaces that made people feel at home, safe, happy. And did you succeed? I never got the chance to try. I graduated 6 months ago. I was looking for an internship when my father told me I needed to come here. Leonard was silent, processing this information. Helen noticed how different he looked in the soft light of the library, less intimidating and more human. Helen, he said finally, I need to tell you something about why you're here. Before he could continue, the house intercom buzzed. Mrs. Davies appeared at the library door. Mr. Croft, Mr. Peterson is here. He says it's urgent. Leonard sighed. Send him in. A few minutes later, a tall, elegant man entered the library. He was about 40, with graying temples, wearing a navy blue suit that cost more than Helen earned in 3 months selling clothes. When he saw Helen, his face lit up with an interest she immediately recognized, and that made her uncomfortable. Marcus Peterson, Leonard said, clearly annoyed by the interruption. My lawyer. Marcus, this is Helen. Marcus approached and extended his hand. Helen Miller, I've heard a lot about you. The way he held her hand a little longer than necessary made Helen sure that Leonard had told him far more than he should have about the situation. Mr. Croft, Marcus said, but his eyes remained fixed on Helen. We need to talk about the Miller construction case. There have been developments. You can speak in front of her, Leonard said. After all, it's about her family. Marcus hesitated. Perhaps we should talk in private. Marcus, Leonard said, and there was a subtle threat in his voice. Speak. The FBI has opened a formal investigation into the practices of Miller Construction in the 90s. They've found not only fiscal irregularities, but also labor violations. Forced labor, in fact, at 3 construction sites in upstate New York. Helen felt the world spin again. Forced labor? Rural workers brought up from the South with promises of good wages, Marcus continued. Housed in subhuman conditions with their documents confiscated without receiving payment. Some tried to escape and were intimidated. Intimidated how? Helen asked, her voice almost a whisper. Physical violence, threats to their families. One of the workers died under suspicious circumstances. Helen leaned against the bookshelf. Her legs didn't seem able to support her. Leonard instinctively moved toward her, as if to catch her if she fell, but stopped halfway, as if remembering she was his prisoner, not someone he should protect. Robert Miller was always a worm, Leonard said. This just confirms it. There's more, Marcus said, clearly uncomfortable. The investigation is being led by the FBI's Human Trafficking and Forced Labor Unit. The agent in charge of the case is Francis Croft. Leonard turned pale. Croft? Your mother's cousin, her sister's daughter. Francis knows about the connection between you and the case. She approached me yesterday. Helen looked between the two men, trying to understand the implications. What does that mean? It means, Marcus said, that the situation has become much more complicated. Francis knows Helen is here. She knows about the agreement between you and Robert Miller, and she's asking very uncomfortable questions about the legality of it all. Leonard began pacing the library like a caged animal. What exactly did she say? That if Helen doesn't voluntarily appear to testify about what she knows of her father's activities in the next 15 days, she will consider the possibility that Helen is being held against her will. But I am being held against my will, Helen said. Marcus looked at her with an expression that mixed sympathy and personal interest. That's exactly the point, Helen. Do you want to remain here, or would you like me to arrange for your departure? Leonard stopped pacing and looked at Helen. There was something in his eyes she couldn't decipher. Fear, hope, desperation. Helen began, but realized she didn't know the answer. 3 weeks ago she would have begged to leave, but now, after discovering the truth about her father, after seeing the ghosts Leonard carried, after feeling that for the first time in her life someone was being completely honest with her about their intentions and motivations, she wasn't sure what she wanted. I need time to think, she said. Helen, Marcus said, moving closer, you need to understand that you're in a very dangerous situation, not just legally, but personally. Leonard is a man who has lost a lot. Sometimes people like that do things they later regret. Helen looked at Leonard. He was watching the conversation as if he were a spectator, not one of the protagonists. But she could see the tension in his jaw, the way his hands were clenched into fists. Marcus, she said finally, thank you for your concern, but for now I choose to stay. The relief on Leonard's face was almost imperceptible, but Helen noticed it. And in that moment, she understood that something fundamental had changed between them. She was no longer there just as a prisoner. She was there because she wanted to understand not only what had happened in the past, but what could happen in the future. Marcus seemed disappointed, but not surprised. Very well, but Helen, if you change your mind, you can call me any time. He took a card from his pocket and handed it to her. My personal number is on the back. After Marcus left, Helen and Leonard were alone in the library. The air between them was charged with a tension that hadn't existed before. Why did you choose to stay? Leonard asked. Helen considered several possible answers. She could say she wanted to better understand what her father had done. She could say she felt safer here than dealing with the FBI. She could lie and say it was just curiosity. Instead, she decided to be honest. Because looking at you, I see a man who has been drowning in pain and anger for 20 years. And because looking at me, I see a woman who has spent her whole life pretending everything was fine when it wasn't. Maybe we can help each other stop drowning. Leonard looked at her for a long moment. Then he approached slowly, until he was just inches away. Helen could feel the warmth of his body, the scent of his cologne mixed with whiskey, and something she was beginning to recognize as his own scent. Helen, he said, his voice hoarse, you have no idea the danger you're in. What danger? The danger of me starting to care about you. Because when I care about someone, I tend to destroy everything around me. Helen raised her hand and lightly touched his face. His skin was warm, rough from his stubble. Leonard closed his eyes at her touch, as if it were both a pain and a relief. Maybe, she said softly, it's time for you to learn to build instead of destroy. Leonard opened his eyes and looked at her with an intensity that made Helen's stomach clench. For a moment, she thought he was going to kiss her. She almost wished he would, but instead he pulled away. Good night, Helen, he said, and left the library, leaving her alone with the taste of whiskey in her mouth and her heart beating erratically in her chest. The following days were charged with an electric tension that seemed to make the air in the mansion vibrate. Helen and Leonard would meet in the hallways, the kitchen, the library, and there was always that moment of gazes that lasted longer than they should, of physical proximity that neither of them seemed able to completely control. Helen began to notice small details about him that had gone unnoticed before. The way he ran a hand through his hair when he was nervous, how his voice became slightly hoarse when he spoke to her first thing in the morning, the way he looked at her hands when she gestured while talking, and especially how he always seemed to be fighting some impulse when they were alone. On the Thursday of the 4th week, Helen was at the pool. She had discovered some forgotten swimsuits in a locker in the changing room, probably from one of Leonard's ex-girlfriends or old guests. She chose a simple navy blue bikini and decided to swim a few laps. The water was heated, and the movement helped her process everything she had discovered about her father. She was stretching at the edge of the pool when Leonard appeared. He was wearing only black swimming trunks and had a towel thrown over his shoulder. His body was more muscular than she had imagined, not exaggerated like a bodybuilder's, but defined in a way that showed he took care of himself. "Sorry," he said, stopping at the entrance to the pool area. "I didn't know you were here." "It's your house," Helen replied, but she didn't get out of the water. "I can leave if you want to use the pool alone. You don't have to." Leonard got into the water and began to swim with long, efficient strokes. Helen watched him discreetly. There was something almost meditative in the way he moved in the water, as if it were the only place he could clear his mind. When he stopped to rest at the opposite edge of the pool, she swam over to him. "You're a good swimmer," she said. "I used to be better. I trained when I was a teenager." Before everything fell apart, Leonard looked at her. Droplets of water ran down his face, making it hard for Helen to tell if there were tears mixed with the pool water. "Helen, I need to tell you something about why you're really here." "I know why I'm here. You've already explained it to me." "Not everything." Leonard leaned on the edge of the pool. "When I planned this revenge, when I decided I was going to make your father pay, I didn't expect..." "Didn't expect what?" "I didn't expect you to be... you." Helen moved closer to him in the water. They were so close she could see the small scars on his chest, count his wet eyelashes, feel his breath mingling with hers. "And who did you expect me to be?" "Someone like him. Superficial, greedy, cruel. Someone I could use and discard without feeling remorse." "And now?" Leonard raised his hand and touched her face, pushing back a wet strand of hair. "Now I'm lost." The kiss happened like something inevitable, like gravity or the sunrise. Leonard pulled her to him and kissed her with a desperate urgency, as if she were the last drop of water in the desert. Helen responded with the same intensity, her arms around his neck, their bodies pressed together under the water. When they finally broke apart, they were both breathless. "Helen," Leonard said, his voice hoarse, "this can't happen." "Why not?" "Because I'll hurt you. It's what I do. It's what I always do." "Maybe it's time you stopped hurting yourself too." Leonard kissed her again, this time slower, deeper. His hands explored her back, the curve of her waist, and Helen felt a fire spreading through her body that had nothing to do with the pool's temperature. They got out of the water without speaking, grabbed their towels, and went up to the second floor of the house. In the hallway, Leonard hesitated. "Are you sure?" he asked. "Of nothing," Helen answered honestly. "But I'm going to do it anyway." Leonard's room was Spartan compared to the rest of the house. A king-sized bed with white sheets, a dresser, a closet, an armchair near the window. No personal objects in sight, no photos, no decorations that revealed anything about who he really was. Leonard pushed her gently against the closed door and kissed her again. This time Helen could feel all the desperation, all the loneliness, all the need he had kept bottled up for years. His hands trembled as they untied her bikini. "Helen," he said, stopping abruptly, "have you ever—" She understood the question. "No." Leonard closed his eyes. "Shit. What's the problem?" "You deserve someone better than me for your first time, someone who can love you without destroying you in the process." Helen placed her hands on his face, forcing him to look into her eyes. "Leonard, I don't want someone better. I want you, exactly as you are, hurt, angry, lost. I want you." What happened next was intense in a way. Helen had never imagined it could be. Leonard was gentle, patient, but there was a desperate urgency in every touch, as if he were trying to memorize every inch of her skin. When the initial pain subsided, Helen lost herself in a sense of completeness she didn't know existed. Afterward, they lay in silence, her heart beating against his chest, their bodies still intertwined. Helen had her head on Leonard's shoulder and could feel that he was awake, tense. "What are you thinking about?" she asked. "That I've made the biggest mistake of my life." Helen propped herself up on her elbow to look at his face. "Thanks. Exactly what every woman wants to hear after her first time." "That's not it," Leonard said quickly. You were perfect. That's why it was a mistake." "I don't understand." Leonard sat up in bed, his back against the headboard. Helen, I've spent 20 years of my life building armor. I learned not to feel anything that could hurt me. And now you show up and in 4 weeks, you manage to make it all crumble. And that's a bad thing? It's dangerous for you and for me. Helen covered herself with the sheet and sat up next to him. Leonard, what are you afraid will happen if you love me? That I'll destroy you like your father destroyed my mother, that I'll become the monster I've always fought against. You're not your father. I'm not a good man either, Helen. You don't know everything I've done to get where I am, the people I've destroyed, the rules I've broken. Helen was silent for a moment, processing. Tell me. What? Everything. Tell me everything you've done. Let me decide if I can handle it or not. Leonard looked at her as if she had completely lost her mind. Helen, I have a right to know who the man I just made love with is. For the next 2 hours, Leonard told her everything. How he built his empire of companies. How he used insider information to destroy competitors. How he paid political bribes to get public contracts. How he laundered money through shell companies. How he obsessively investigated Robert Miller's life for years, waiting for the right moment to strike. And worst of all, he said finally, is that I enjoyed it. Every moment, the feeling of power, watching my enemies fall, knowing I was above the rules that limit normal people. Helen absorbed it all in silence. When Leonard finished, she got out of bed. Where are you going? He asked. To take a shower, to think. And then? Then we're going to have dinner, and you're going to tell me about your mother. Not about what my father did to her, but about who she was before that. What her favorite songs were, what kind of food she liked to cook, what her laugh sounded like. Leonard looked confused. Why? Because you've spent so much time defining your mother, by the tragedy that you've forgotten to remember the woman she was, and because after dinner, we're going to the Berkshires to visit her. Helen, no, you don't understand. I understand perfectly. You're afraid she won't like me. You're afraid that seeing us together will make her remember things it's better to forget. But mostly, you're afraid that if she approves of our, whatever this is we have, you'll no longer have an excuse to hide behind your anger. Helen headed for the bathroom door but stopped before entering. Oh, and Leonard, one thing I learned selling clothes at the mall is that people have layers. No one is all good or all bad. You did bad things for the wrong reasons, but you also did bad things for the right reasons. And now you have a chance to do something right for the right reason. What right thing? Helen smiled. It was the first genuine smile she had given since she arrived at the mansion. Choosing to love instead of hate. Choosing to build instead of destroy. Choosing to trust that maybe, just maybe, you deserve to be happy. After she went into the bathroom, Leonard was left alone, in the room staring at the rumpled sheets that still carried her scent. Outside it started to rain again over the Hamptons, but this time the sound didn't seem melancholic. It sounded like a promise that all things, even the driest and most parched, could bloom again if they received the right water at the right time. In the bathroom, Helen let the hot water from the shower wash away not just the chlorine from the pool, but also the fear she had carried since she arrived. She was 22 and had just discovered she was capable of loving a man who could destroy her. But she had also discovered that she might be able to save him, and for the first time in months, that seemed to be enough. Leonard disappeared for 3 days. Helen woke up the next morning expecting to find him at breakfast, perhaps embarrassed, perhaps regretful, but there. Instead, she found only Mrs. Davies, who avoided looking her directly in the eye. "Mr. Leonard is travelling," the woman said, nervously fidgeting with her apron. "Business in D.C. He said he'll be back at the end of the week." Helen knew it was a lie. His coffee was still warm in the cup on the kitchen counter. His car keys were in their usual spot. Leonard hadn't travelled. He was hiding. The first night alone, she went to his room. The door was locked. The second night, she tried the music room. Also locked. On the third night, she found him in the study, asleep in the leather armchair with a half-empty bottle of whiskey beside him. "Leonard," she said softly. He woke with a start, eyes red, hair messy, shirt wrinkled. He looked like a man who hadn't slept properly in months. "Helen, what are you doing here? I live here, remember, and you've been avoiding me for 3 days." Leonard staggered to his feet and walked to the window, turning his back to her. "I thought you'd get the message." "What message? That you're a coward?" He turned sharply. "Be careful, Helen." "Or what, you'll lock me in my room again? You'll pretend nothing happened between us?" "Nothing should have happened between us." Helen walked toward him. "But it did, and you can pretend it was a mistake all you want. But I saw your eyes in that moment. You felt the same thing." "I did." Leonard laughed bitterly. "And what did you feel, Helen? Pity? Morbid curiosity?" The question was like a slap in the face. Helen took a step back. "How can you ask that?" "Because it's the only explanation that makes sense. A 22-year-old girl, beautiful, intelligent, with her whole life ahead of her, doesn't fall in love with a man who is using her to get revenge on her father." "I didn't say I was in love with you." "No?" Helen hesitated, because the truth was too complicated to be spoken aloud. "I said I wanted you. I said I wanted to truly know you. I said I thought we could help each other. And I said I'm dangerous, that I hurt everything I touch." "Nonsense." "Nonsense." Leonard approached her, and Helen could smell the alcohol and desperation. "You want to know how I made my first million, Helen? I stole a product formula from a pharmaceutical lab and sold it to a competitor. The guy who developed the formula lost his job, couldn't prove the idea was his, fell into a depression and killed himself." Helen felt a chill in her stomach. "Leonard, want more?" 5 years ago, a business rival was getting in the way of one of my deals. I found out he was having an affair. I sent pictures to his wife. She filed for divorce, took half the company. He lost custody of his kids. Last week, I heard he's living in a boarding house downtown, drinking himself unconscious every night. Why are you telling me this? Because you need to understand who I am. Not the wounded man who plays the piano and misses his mother. I'm a monster who builds fortunes on the pain of others. And if you stay here, I will destroy you too." Helen was silent for a long moment. Then she approached him and placed her hand on his chest, feeling his racing heart. "You want to know what I think, Leonard? I think you're telling me these stories not to scare me, but to convince yourself that you don't deserve to be loved. I think you're more afraid of the possibility of being happy than you are of the possibility of hurting me." Leonard removed her hand from his chest. "You're wrong." "Am I? Then prove it. Let's go to the Berkshires tomorrow to visit your mother. If you really are the monster you say you are, if you really feel nothing for me but convenience for your revenge, you won't mind introducing me to her." "Helen, no." "Why not? Afraid she'll like me? Afraid she'll want you to be happy instead of punishing yourself for the rest of your life?" Leonard filled a glass with whiskey and drank it all at once. "My mother won't want to see you. She doesn't like visitors. She gets agitated." "How do you know? When was the last time you brought someone to meet her?" "Never." "Exactly." Helen headed for the office door. "I'm going to the Berkshires tomorrow, Leonard. With you or without you. If you want me to go alone and find out things about your family that you might prefer I didn't know, that's your problem." She left the office and went to her room, leaving Leonard alone with his ghosts and his bottle of whiskey. The next morning, Helen woke up determined to keep her promise. She put on a simple outfit, jeans, a white blouse, flat shoes, and went down to the kitchen. Leonard wasn't there. "Mrs. Davies," Helen said, "I need to go to the Berkshires today. Can you arrange a car for me?" The woman seemed nervous. "Miss, I can't do that without Mr. Leonard's authorization." "Then I'll take a bus." "Helen." The voice came from behind her. It was Leonard, dressed in jeans and a blue polo shirt. He looked like he had showered and shaved, but his eyes were still tired. "I'll take you." The drive to the Berkshires took 2 hours. They spoke little along the way. Leonard drove with concentration, stopping only once for gas and coffee. Helen looked at the mountainous landscape and tried to imagine what it would be like to meet the woman who had so shaped the life of the man beside her. St. Teresa's retreat was in a secluded area of the region, surrounded by pine trees and mountains. It was a beautiful place, but it carried in the air that peculiar sadness of places where people try to forget who they used to be. "Marion Smith," Leonard said to the receptionist. "I'm Leonard, her son." The nurse, a middle-aged woman with a professional smile, led them down the corridors to an inner garden where several elderly people were sunbathing in wheelchairs or walking slowly along stone paths. Marion was sitting at a chessboard playing by herself. She was 63 with grey hair tied in a bun and wore a simple blue dress. When she saw them approaching, her eyes lit up. "Leonard," she said, getting up to hug her son. "You came." "Hi, Mom. How are you feeling?" "Good, very good. I won 3 games of chess against the nurse this morning." Marion looked at Helen with curiosity. "And who is this pretty young lady?" "Marion," Leonard said, clearly uncomfortable. "This is Helen. A friend." Marion studied Helen with intelligent eyes that didn't seem to belong to a person with mental health issues. "Helen, a beautiful name. You have sad eyes, dear." Helen was surprised by the observation. "Thank you, Mrs. Croft. Leonard has told me a lot about you." "Has he? Good things, I hope." "Only good things." Marion gestured for them to sit. "Leonard, did you bring Helen here to introduce me because you two are dating?" Leonard turned red. "Mom, don't be embarrassed, my son. You're 35 already. It's high time you had a decent girlfriend." Helen smiled. "Mrs. Croft, it's more complicated than that. Love is always complicated, dear. What matters is if you make each other happy." "Mom," Leonard interrupted, "how are your medications? Are the doctors treating you well?" Marion made a face. "The doctors think I'm crazy. They think I make up stories about the past." "What kind of stories?" Helen asked, ignoring the warning look Leonard gave her. "About the man who destroyed our family. About how he used information he shouldn't have had to blackmail innocent people. The doctors say it's paranoia." Helen felt a chill down her spine. "What information?" Marion looked around as if checking if anyone could be listening. "He knew about the affair I was having." Leonard turned pale. "Mom, what are you talking about?" "Robert Miller. He knew I was having an affair with a colleague from work. He said he had pictures of us leaving hotels. He threatened to show them to your father if I didn't close the investigation." Helen felt the world spin. "You had an affair?" "For 3 months. Your father traveled a lot. I felt lonely. It was a terrible mistake, but I was going to confess everything to him when he got back from his last trip." Marion looked at Leonard with tears in her eyes. "But Robert Miller got there first." Leonard was as white as a sheet. "Why did you never tell me this?" "Because you were too young, and because I was ashamed, not just of the affair, but of being a coward, of not facing the threats, of choosing to protect my marriage instead of doing the right thing." Helen understood in that moment that the story was much more complicated than Leonard had told her. Her father hadn't just blackmailed an upstanding auditor. He had blackmailed a woman who had a real secret to hide. "Mom," Leonard said, his voice almost a whisper. "Did Dad know?" "He never knew about the affair, but when I started having the panic attacks when I couldn't work properly anymore, I think he suspected there was something more. He tried to get me to talk, but I couldn't tell the truth. The guilt was killing me." Marion turned to Helen. "That's why I got sick, dear. It wasn't just because of the blackmail. It was because I knew I deserved what was happening to me. I had betrayed my husband. I had failed at my job. I had been a coward when I should have been strong." Helen stood up from her chair. "Excuse me," she said, and walked quickly away from the table. Leonard followed her. "Helen, wait." She turned to him, her eyes full of tears. 20 years, Leonard. For 20 years you fed this anger, built this empire of revenge because you thought my father had destroyed an innocent woman. He did destroy. He blackmailed a woman who was cheating on her husband. That doesn't make it right, but it changes everything. Your mother was complicit in what happened. She made bad choices and paid for them." Leonard held her arms. "Helen, that doesn't change anything about what your father did. It was still blackmail. It was still an abuse of power. But it changes everything about your motivations. You weren't seeking justice, Leonard. You were seeking revenge for a story you never fully knew." Helen pulled away from him and walked back to where Marion was sitting. "Mrs. Croft," she said, kneeling beside the woman's chair. "Do you know who my father is?" Marion studied her carefully. "Miller, Helen Miller, you're Robert Miller's daughter." "Yes." "My God," Marion whispered. "Leonard, what have you done?" "What I had to do," Leonard replied, but his voice no longer carried the conviction it once did. Marion looked between them. "Do you two love each other?" Helen looked at Leonard. He was staring at the distant mountains, his jaw clenched, his hands in fists. "I don't know," Helen said finally. "I thought so, but I don't know any more if what I feel is love or Stockholm Syndrome." Marion took Helen's hand. "Dear, can I tell you a secret?" "Of course. It wasn't your father who destroyed me. It was myself, the choices I made, the secrets I kept, the cowardice I showed. Robert Miller just took advantage of my weaknesses, but the weaknesses were already there." Marion turned to Leonard. "My son, you've spent 20 years hating the wrong man. The man you should hate is in the mirror." The visit ended in silence. Leonard and Helen said goodbye to Marion and returned to the car. The drive back to New York was tense, heavy with revelations that changed the dynamic of everything they had built. When they arrived at the mansion in the Hamptons, they found Marcus waiting in the living room. He wasn't alone. A woman in her 40s, with short hair and serious clothes, was with him. "Leonard," Marcus said, standing up, "this is Agent Francis Croft, your mother's cousin." Francis studied Leonard with hard eyes. "Leonard, you've grown up." "Francis, I didn't expect to see you here." "I imagine not." Francis turned to Helen. "Helen Miller, I presume?" "Yes. I need to talk to you about your situation here and about your father's activities." Marcus approached Helen. "Helen, I've explained the situation to the agent. She's here to ensure you're safe and to discuss the legal options you have." Helen looked among the three of them. Leonard seemed tense but not surprised, as if he knew this moment would eventually come. "What options?" she asked. "The option to press charges against Leonard for unlawful imprisonment, the option to cooperate with the investigation against your father, and the option to leave here today under police protection." Helen looked at Leonard. He was staring at the floor, as if he had already accepted defeat. "And what if I don't want any of those options?" Francis frowned. "What do you mean?" "What if I want to stay here of my own free will?" "Helen," Marcus said, moving closer, "you need to understand that you're in a state of psychological vulnerability. It's normal to develop confused feelings for your captor. But this isn't real love." Helen looked at Marcus and saw something in his eyes she hadn't noticed before. Personal interest, possessiveness, desire. "Marcus," she said slowly, "how long have you been in love with me?" The man turned red. "Helen, I'm just concerned for your well-being." "How long?" she repeated. "Since the first time Leonard showed me your picture," he said finally. "Since the first moment I knew he was going to bring you here. I tried to dissuade him, not because of the legality, but because I knew you didn't deserve to go through this." Helen understood in that moment that she was at the center of a battle between three men, each believing they knew what was best for her. Leonard with his obsessive revenge, Marcus with his possessive passion, and her father with his selfish indifference. "Francis," Helen said, "can I have one night to decide?" The agent hesitated. "Helen, if you're being coerced—" "I'm not being coerced, but I need time to process all of this." Francis reluctantly agreed. She and Marcus left, but not before. Marcus handed Helen another card. "If you need anything," he said, "any time." After they left, Helen and Leonard were alone in the room. The silence between them was heavy with everything that had been said and unsaid. "Helen," Leonard said finally. "No," she interrupted him. "Don't say anything. Tomorrow I'm leaving. I'm going to cooperate with the investigation against my father. I'm going to try to rebuild my life away from all this madness." "Helen, please." "And you know why? Not because you're a monster, not because I'm afraid of you, but because I've finally understood that you don't want to be saved. You like carrying this pain, it defines you, and I can't love someone who chooses suffering over happiness. Helen went up to her room and packed her bags. Outside, it began to rain again over the Hamptons, but this time the rain sounded like goodbye. Helen left the mansion the next morning with the same small suitcase she had arrived with 2 months earlier. Leonard didn't come to say goodbye. Mrs. Davies cried as she hugged her at the door. "You were the best thing that's happened to this house in a long time," the woman whispered. "He doesn't know what he's losing." "He knows," Helen replied. "That's why he's letting me go." Marcus was waiting with a car at the entrance to the community. He smiled when he saw her approaching, but the smile didn't reach his eyes. "You made the right decision," he said, taking her suitcase. "I'll take you to a safe apartment in Soho. Agent Francis wants to talk to you this afternoon." During the drive, Helen looked out the window at the streets of New York. After 2 months isolated in the Hamptons, the city seemed more chaotic, more real, more alive, but also more frightening. For the first time in months, she didn't know exactly what would happen in the next few hours. The apartment Marcus had arranged was small but comfortable. 1 bedroom, living room, open kitchen, bathroom. Basic furniture, but clean. He put her suitcase in the bedroom and poured himself a coffee he had prepared. "Helen?" he said, approaching her. "Can I say something?" "Of course. I know this isn't the ideal time, but I need you to know that during these 2 months, I thought about you every day. I wondered if you were okay, if Leonard was treating you with respect." Helen moved back a little. "Marcus, I appreciate your concern, but—" "Let me finish." He held her arm gently. "I know you developed feelings for him. It's natural, considering the circumstances. But now that you're free, you can see things clearly." "What things?" "That what you had wasn't love. It was an illusion created by trauma, by emotional dependency. You can have a real life now, Helen. With me." Helen looked at his hand on her arm. "Marcus, let go of me. Helen, I love you. I truly love you. Not like Leonard, who used you to get revenge on your father. Marcus, let go now." Instead of letting go, he squeezed tighter. "You don't understand. I arranged all of this. The apartment, the police protection, even the investigation against your father. All to save you from him." Helen felt a chill down her spine. "What do you mean, arranged all of this?" "I convinced Agent Francis to expedite the investigation. I was the one who suggested she contact you. I was the one who planted the idea that you were being held against your will. But I was being held against my will in the beginning." "In the beginning, yes, but for the last few weeks you could have left at any time. Leonard wasn't watching you anymore. You stayed because you wanted to." Helen tried to pull away, but Marcus was stronger. "Because I wanted what?" "Because you were confused. Because you developed Stockholm Syndrome. Because you had nowhere to go." Marcus moved closer. "But now you do. You have me." "Marcus, you're scaring me. Let me go." "I can't do that, Helen. I can't let you go back to him." "I'm not going back to him. I said I was leaving, and I left." "But you still love him. I can see it in your eyes." Helen began to understand the scale of what was happening. "Marcus, where is Agent Francis?" "She's not coming until tomorrow. That gives us time to talk calmly." "Time for what?" "To show you how good it can be to be with someone who truly loves you, someone who doesn't use you, doesn't blackmail you, doesn't keep you prisoner." Helen looked around the apartment and noticed things she hadn't before. The windows had bars, the front door had 3 locks, there was no phone. "Marcus," she said, trying to keep her voice calm, "you're kidnapping me." "I'm saving you." "The same way Leonard thought he was getting justice?" Marcus paused, as if the comparison had hit him. "It's not the same thing." "It's exactly the same thing. You think you know what's best for me, and you're willing to keep me prisoner until I agree with you." "I love you." "No," Helen interrupted. "You're obsessed with me. Love isn't a prison, Marcus. Love is freedom." At that moment, the apartment door burst open. Leonard entered like a force of nature, followed by 2 men Helen didn't recognize. His face was transformed by a rage she had never seen before. "Take your hand off her," Leonard said, his voice low and dangerous. Marcus let go of Helen and stood in front of her, as if to protect her. Leonard, you have no right to be here. I have more right than you. She chose to come with me. She chose to leave my house. She didn't choose to be your prisoner. Helen stepped forward. How did you know where I was? I put a tracker on your phone, Leonard said, without taking his eyes off Marcus. Sorry for the invasion of privacy, but something told me you weren't safe. You were right. Marcus looked between them. You're both crazy. Helen, you can't go back to him. He'll destroy you. And you were going to save me by keeping me prisoner in an apartment with bars on the windows? It was temporary, until you understood. Understood what? That you decided for me who I should be with. That you manipulated a federal investigation to rescue me from a situation I had already left on my own. Leonard approached slowly. Helen, do you want to come with me? She looked at him. She saw the man who had held her prisoner for revenge, but she also saw the man who had played the piano in the dead of night, who had cried talking about his mother, who had been gentle with her the first time, the man who had just risked everything to save her from another captor. Yes, she said, I do. They left the apartment, leaving Marcus alone with his two men, who Helen realized were security guards, not police officers. On the street, Leonard helped her into a car she didn't recognize. Where's your car? She asked. I had to sell it, among other things. What do you mean? Leonard drove in silence for a few minutes before answering. After you left, I made some calls, cancelled all the questionable deals, returned money I had earned illegally, confessed to some crimes to the FBI. Helen looked at him, shocked. Why? Because you were right. I didn't want to be saved. I liked carrying the pain because it gave me an excuse not to try to be happy. Leonard stopped at a red light and finally looked at her. But when you left, when I realized I had lost you, I understood that I'd rather try to be happy and fail than never try at all. And now? Now I'm broke. Financially, legally, emotionally. I'll probably spend a few years in prison. I lost the company, the mansion, almost everything. And your mother. I moved her to a better private clinic. It's the last good thing I can do for her before I pay for my crimes. Helen was silent, processing. Where are we going? Wherever you want. There's a little clean money left over, enough for you to start over somewhere else if you want. And you? I'm turning myself into the FBI tomorrow morning. Helen felt tears in her eyes. Leonard, you don't have to do this. Yes, I do. For me, for you, for my mother. For the 20 years I wasted feeding hatred instead of trying to build something good. Leonard parked the car in front of a small house on the coast of Maine. It was simple, white, with a view of the sea, a small but well-kept garden in front. What is this place? Helen asked. A house I bought a few years ago, the only property that's in my real name. No shell companies, no dirty money. I thought you could stay here while you decide what you want to do with your life. They entered the house. It was beautiful in its simplicity. A small living room with a sea view, an open kitchen, 2 bedrooms, an art studio with large windows. On the walls were a few paintings, not the expensive abstracts from the mansion, but simple watercolors of seascapes. Did you paint these? Helen asked. My mother taught me when I was a child, before everything fell apart. Helen walked to the studio window. The sea was calm, reflecting the afternoon sun like a golden mirror. Leonard, what do you want from me? Nothing, he said. That's why I'm leaving tonight. I want you to have the chance to discover who you are, away from me, away from your father, away from all this madness. And after, if you still want to see me when I get out of prison, maybe we can try again. The right way this time. Helen turned to him. How many years could you get? 5, maybe 6. If I cooperate with the investigation, it could be less. She moved closer, to him. Leonard, I need to ask you something, and I want you to be completely honest. Anything. Do you love me? Or am I still being used for some kind of atonement for your sins? Leonard was silent for a long moment. When you arrived at the mansion, I wanted to hate you. I wanted you to be a female version of your father so it would be easy to use and discard you. But you weren't. You were brave, intelligent, kind, even to me, who didn't deserve kindness. And now I love you in a way that scares me. I love you so much that I'm willing to let you go so you can be happy without me. I love you so much that I'd rather spend 5 years in prison knowing you're free and safe than spend 5 years on the run from the law knowing you're in danger because of me. Helen placed her hand on his face. And what if I say I'd rather be in danger with you than safe without you? I'd say you're still confused, that you need time away from me to be sure of your feelings. Helen kissed him. It was a soft kiss, filled with everything they couldn't express with words. When they parted, they both had tears in their eyes. Go, she said. Do what you have to do. Pay for your crimes. Heal. And when you get out, if you still want me, come find me. Leonard nodded. And if you don't want me anymore? Then you'll have learned to be happy on your own. Either way, it will be a victory. He left that night, leaving the keys to the house and an envelope with enough money for her to live comfortably for 2 years. He also left a letter that said only, "Thank you for teaching me that love can heal even the most broken hearts." Helen stayed in the coastal house for 2 years. She learned to paint, started to write, and opened a small interior design studio. She went to therapy twice a week to process everything she had been through. She discovered who she was away from her father's shadow, away from Leonard's obsession, away from everyone's expectations. She discovered she was stronger than she imagined, more resilient, more capable of self-love. Leonard was sentenced to 4 years in prison but was released in 2.5 for good behavior and cooperation with the authorities. During his time in prison, he went to therapy, studied, and helped other inmates with legal problems. He learned to meditate, to forgive himself, to imagine a future without anger. When he got out, he didn't look for Helen immediately. He lived in a small apartment in downtown New York, got a job at an NGO that helped ex-convicts reintegrate into society. He visited his mother religiously. He learned to live without needing revenge or hatred to motivate him. 2.5 years after their separation, Helen was in a church under renovation in the coastal town where she lived. She had won the bid to restore the old stained glass windows. She was focused on her work, her hands stained with paint, when she felt someone watching her. It was Leonard. Thinner, with shorter hair, but his eyes were different, lighter, without the shadow of anger they once carried. "Hi," he said simply. "Hi," she replied. They looked at each other for a long moment, two survivors of a storm that had nearly destroyed them but had finally passed. "Are you okay?" he asked. "I am. And you?" "I'm learning to be." Helen climbed down from the ladder where she was working and approached him. "What are you doing here?" "I work for an NGO that's renovating this church. When I heard the designer in charge of the stained glass was named Helen Miller, I thought it might be a coincidence. But it wasn't. It wasn't." They walked out of the church together. The sun was setting over the sea, painting the sky pink and gold. "Helen," Leonard said, "I wanted you to know that if you're happy, if you've built a good life here, I don't want to interfere. I can leave and—" "Leonard," she interrupted, "stop talking." He stopped. "I love you," she said simply. "I loved you when you were an angry man obsessed with revenge. I loved you when you sacrificed yourself to save me from Marcus. And I love you now that you seem to have found peace. Helen, but I don't want to go back to where we were. I want to find out who we can be now." Leonard smiled. It was the first genuine smile she had seen from him since they met. "What do you have in mind?" "First, coffee, then a walk on the beach, then a long talk about everything that's happened in the last 2 years. And then we'll take it slow and see where it goes." "Sounds like a perfect plan." Helen took his hand. It was the same hand that had played the piano with melancholy, that had held her face the first time they kissed, that had signed the confession that sent him to prison. But now it was calmer, warmer, freer. "Leonard," she said, as they walked down the small town's main street. "Yes?" "Next time. You want to give me a house as a gift. Ask me first if I want it." Leonard laughed. Next time I want to give you anything, I'll ask first." "Good," Helen said, smiling. "It's a start." And as they walked hand in hand toward the sea, with the stained glass windows of the old church glowing in the twilight behind them, Helen thought that maybe some love stories have to almost end to truly begin, and that maybe the greatest courage isn't loving someone perfect, but choosing to love someone who is willing to transform themselves for love. The sea was no longer stormy. The waves lapped gently at the sand, like a whispered promise that after every storm a calm always comes, and in that calm, two wounded people who had learned to heal separately could finally try to heal together.